Welcome to knife training and safety. For those of you who don't know, my name is Jeff Arthur. I'm the executive chef for Culinary Services. And what we want to talk about today is how to use a knife, proper cutting techniques for things that you would see in your dining hall and across campus. So just for general knife safety topics, we all know that when we're carrying a knife that it sits down to our side, tipped down, never walk with it pointing out so you're not trying to stab anyone as you're walking through the kitchen. You should always hold a knife by the handle, never by the blade. That even goes when someone asks you to hand them a knife, you grab the knife, you put it down on the counter and allow them to grab the handle. It doesn't matter if you're holding onto the blade and then handing them the handle or vice versa. There's always a potential that someone will pull and you'll have the opportunity to cut your hand. We also want to talk a little bit about knife cut gloves. It's required all the time in our facilities. I want to point out that cut gloves are good for across the grain cutting. You still have the opportunity to stab through them. It's just a fine wire that's running through them, so the tip of a knife can still puncture through that. So it's important that we're not cutting into our hand as much as possible. There are a few things that we do in our facilities where cutting in your hand is deemed okay, but we'd still prefer that you try not doing that. And then with the cut glove, it always needs to be accompanied by a disposable glove. And the reason why we want that is cut gloves are an absorbent material. So it can absorb your hand sweat. And then, disposable gloves are not impenetrable. They do rip and tear. And you all may, at times you could cut it with your knife accidentally. And then any juice or any product that you're working with can get into your cut glove. So again, cut gloves are always paired with disposable gloves. And then also when you're done using your cut glove, please throw it in the laundry so it has a chance to be washed before the next person grabs it. Otherwise, it's a potential cross-contamination issue. If a knife is falling, in comparison to you reaching for a knife and potentially cutting your hand, our knives are cheap. So we ask that we let a $20 knife hit the ground and break versus you trying to reach the knife and cutting your hand accidentally. Plus, no one really wants to get cut. It's painful, it's uncomfortable, and no one likes to go to the hospital, hopefully. Let's see. Never place a knife in the sink, regardless of it being full of water or not. If it's an empty sink and you feel like it's safe, it's still not. Someone could come behind you and fill that sink up with water or soapy water, and the next person behind them could come reach down in there and try and grab something out and then potentially cut themselves. So knives should never be placed in a sink at all. And one of the things I want to talk about that I've seen on campus, well, actually I should say I haven't seen on campus, it's called the claw grip, talon grip, eagle claw grip. There's multiple names to it. Most commonly though, it's known as the claw grip. So you'll hold your hand like an eagle talon, like an eagle claw. The idea is that you're actually going to hold the product with the tips of your fingers. This will allow the blade of the knife, the side of the knife, to rest up against your first knuckle. This is for multiple reasons. One, when your fingers are laid out flat, it's a lot easier for them to get underneath your knife and more of a potential for you to cut the tips of your fingers or something like that. But when you have your hands like this, they're much taller than the height that you'll lift your blade, so there's less potential that you'll cut yourself. As well as if someone drops a pan in the kitchen or yells your name or there's commotion, it's our natural reaction as human beings to look up and look for that. But if you have your hands against your knuckle against the side of the blade, you'll know where that blade is at all times. So even if you are distracted, you'll still be safe. You'll still know where that knife is and potentially not cut yourself. One of the other things I wanted to talk about is your station setup. It's just as important. It kind of ties into knife safety as it sets yourself up for an organized station. A cluttered station creates potential hazards, and it also slows down workflow. So what we'd like to see is that your raw product or the product that you're working on is on your non-cutting side. So if you're right-handed, it would be on your left side. If you're left-handed, it'll be on your right side. And then as you're working, it's flowing to your cut side. So all of your finished product will be on your right-hand side if you're right-handed, and the opposite if you're left-handed. I'd also like to see that a waste receptacle, one that is for, what's the word? Compost. One container for compost materials and another one for trash or other materials. And instead of having to pile stuff up and then turn and throw it in a trash can, you can just put it right in front of you and it's out of your way. Again, that's just for workflow. It speeds things up and it creates less movement and twisting and bending and all that kind of stuff for yourself. And it's also important that you gather all of your materials at once and that you do one step at a time all the way through for the product. It's just the French term, the classical term is called mise en place, which just means to put in place. So the idea is that we're putting everything in place before we start. So I'm going to show you a few cuts on some melons that we have, some fruit that we have. And these, I believe, are the most common things that we'll be using in our kitchens here. Unless you're over at CSK, then I think it's a little bit more in depth over there. But for your cutting board, there's always a damp towel underneath it. I always recommend that this towel be a sanitizing solution. It's just another protection against cross-contamination. We launder these with everything and anything that's been soiled. So it goes in there, it gets washed. Washers aren't perfect. So if you give this in a sanitizing solution, it's just another step against cross-contamination, as well as when you're done, you can use this towel as your sanitizing towel to clean up at the end. All right, so all of our fruit has been washed ahead of time. Part of that is because if you've seen in the news lately, within the past few years, most of our foodborne illnesses have come from, say, spinach or cantaloupe. And that's because of the nature of our industry and where we get our food from in the U.S. A lot of the fertilizers and pesticides are derivatives of other industries like the hog industry, cattle industry, and chicken industry. So we need to make sure that we're washing these before we cut into them. Okay, so the cantaloupe has two ends. One is the flower end, one is the stem end. For this one, we want to make sure we're cutting through those two ends. And I can show you why. And that is because the seed line is running lengthwise. If we had cut it the other direction, it creates a smaller pocket and there's less opportunity for us to get all the seeds out, and as well it'll take more of the meat of the fruit that we want to keep away. And I recommend that we use a large spoon when we're digging out the seeds. I know another method is using an ice cream scoop or a portion scoop. It's a perfectly fine thing to do. However, this is more like a surgical tool in getting the seeds out because you can dig into the little crevices, and again, it's a more effective way of saving the edible meat that we want to keep. So we're just going to scrape them out. And I want to also note that sometimes you'll see that the seeds are trying to shoot out. That's as the fruit gets more and more ripe. If you do see them, pick them out. But if you see them at that point, they're going to be all throughout, and there's really nothing we can do about it. They are edible, they're just not as appetizing. So from this point, we're going to cut this into quarters. So that we get 4 wedges, and if you're going to do the whole thing, you'll end up with 8 wedges. But the next step is what we're going to do is we're going to remove the peel or the skin. And the best way to tell where we're going to cut is that there's the fine line in the cantaloupe, there's the orange section, and then it starts to turn green. We want to cut all the green out. So we're going to use a paring knife for this, and off of our cutting board, we're going to follow that green line all the way around and try and take as little of the orange or ripe fruit. So as you can see, there is some orange meat left on there. However, there's not a whole lot, and that's the goal. As little waste as possible. And then you're going to go back through, and obviously, I mean, I'm not perfect, no one's perfect, so go back through and make sure you got all the green, unripe fruit and all the skin taken off. And once you've done that, I'd like you to go back to your chef's knife. You have more control of your chef's knife than you would a paring knife, as well as it's more efficient in that you can grab more than one piece of the fruit and cut it at the same time. And we're looking for bite-size to bite-size and a half pieces, or about an inch square pieces as much as possible. Also, it's not only eye-appealing, but it also, when all the fruit gets mixed together, there's less surface area, so it won't bruise as easily when all the fruit's together. When it's bruised, it gets mushy, all the juices start coming out. So the larger the pieces are, the longer the fruit will last for us. So the next one that I want to demonstrate is a pineapple. Kind of a similar technique, but obviously there are no seeds on the inside, but there is the core. So we're going to cut the two ends off. And we want to cut about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch down, just so that we get into the meat of it. There are a couple of different techniques that we could do. I personally prefer to, at this point, peel the skin. There is the other option of cutting it into quarters, but I'm going to demonstrate this way. I feel like this way is a little bit more safer and a little more efficient. So if you look at the top, you can see where the seeds are starting. That's where I start my cuts, because the goal is to get all of those out. And you also want to follow the curve of the fruit. It's not a square fruit, and I know a lot of times you'll see students do it, and at the end it's square. Well, it's round, so we need to make sure that we're following the curvature of the fruit with our knife. And then from this point, after you have the first one off, I just go back in and start peeling off the skin, and I start where the seeds end. So then you want to go back through, make sure you got as many of the seeds out as possible. And then from this point, I'll go ahead and cut it into quarters and lay them out. And now we have to take out the core. The best way to tell where the core begins and where the edible portion of the meat is that the core runs up and down on the fruit. And the meat of the flesh, it goes left to right. So that's the easiest way to tell, is that there's a different direction of the two parts. And at this point, we're going to cube it, and it's the same principle as before. We want to keep it into bite to bite and a half size pieces. So with one of the quarters, I just cut it in half down the center, and then cut it into chunks. All right, a watermelon. Similar to the pineapple, I'm going to cut off both ends first. And I do this so I have a level cutting surface when I cut it into triangles. And depending on the size of your watermelon will depend on how many triangles you cut this into. You know, I think we've all seen the ones at the store that are this big, and then you see the ones that are, you know, this big. They're the size of a 4-year-old child. So I'm just going to split it down the center. And for this one, I'll probably just cut into 6 pieces. And at this point, you have a couple options. One, you can leave it like this, and then cut wedges or little, the hand-sized style bites, or you can peel it with your knife and then cube it up. I don't know which was most common here.
The wedge.
The wedge. So from this point, about 1/2 inch wedges. And I am using my index finger once the knife has gone into the meat to stabilize the wedge I'm cutting off so it doesn't pull out, and it'll make it easier when you go back to pick it all up. I also want to mention that these cutting gloves are not just for knives that look like this. We have multiple knives in our kitchen that are inside of equipment, such as our meat slicers, our food processors, blenders, tomato dicers, slicers, all those wok pans. Basically anything that has a sharp edge. And to be honest, some of the worst cuts that I've seen in the kitchen come from a tin can lid. The edge of a can lid is just as sharp as our knives, but because of the way the cut is on it, they leave some of the worst cuts because it's not a sharp edge, a fine sharp edge. So you have to take into consideration that when you're opening up a number 10 can, we do need to wear these because those lids are, you need to wear them on both hands because the lids are sharp.